Hey, restless soul. You are safe here with us tonight. This is Nick, and I want you to know you are safe here. If you are tired and weary, anxious and restless, or just need sleep right now, this space was made for you tonight. In a moment from now, we will begin sharing mysterious tales slowly and gently, just for you to help you rest deeply, breathe slowly, and drift away into sleep. Just so you know, there will be a few ads in the first 10 minutes only, then nothing for the rest of the night so you can sleep without interruption. Before we begin our journey, I would love for you to comment below what time it is where you are right now and share what is keeping you awake too, so we can all understand we are not alone in this together. And if this becomes a place you return to for peace, I would be so grateful if you subscribe to keep this space growing. Let us begin right now. The van's headlights died at mile marker 49, 2 switchbacks below the Whitlock gates. I finished the climb on foot through snow that had erased the road 3 days ago. The estate, 4 stories of Pikes Peak limestone, built 1889 by a silver baron who died of mercury poisoning in his own assay office, rose against the front range like a broken incisor. The upper windows were boarded with ACX plywood stamped Westlake Lumber 2009. The lower ones glowed yellow from incandescence running on a generator. I could hear coughing in the basement, rhythmic as a chronic smoker. The driver, a compact man whose face I never properly saw, deposited my single bag on the steps and departed without a word. I stood in the cold, my hands shaking. Withdrawal or fear I could not distinguish, and felt the building watching me. Somewhere above, a shutter banged in the wind. The sound had the rhythm of bones knocking together. I had killed a man on an operating table 4 months prior. That was the simplified version, the one I had repeated to the medical board, to my attorney, to the judge who mandated my presence here. That's the version I told anyway. The version I could still say out loud without my throat closing. The truth, I had been drinking before the surgery. 2 fingers of Blanton's at 6 a.m., enough to steady my hands, but not enough to slur. The patient was a 52-year-old actuary named Gerald Pitkin, and I was repairing his mitral valve. Between the 2nd stitch and the 3rd, the 4-O-proline caught on calcified tissue and tore a papillary muscle I should have seen coming. The rest is blood pressure crashing, the anesthesiologist's voice going flat and procedural, and my hands doing exactly what they'd been trained to do while my brain knew it was already too late. Pitkin arrested at 9:42 a.m. I pronounced him at 10:03 a.m. I dictated the operative note at 10:45 a.m. and was in my car with a bottle by 11 o'clock. The front door opened before I could knock. A woman stood in the frame, backlit, her face in shadow. She wore the white coat of medical authority, but it hung on her with a wrongness I felt before I could articulate. Too long in the sleeves, stained at the cuffs with something rust-colored. She did not introduce herself and only gestured for me to follow. The foyer presented impressive decay. A grand staircase with several banisters missing, parquet floors warped by water damage, the ghost of expensive wallpaper peeling in long strips to reveal plaster underneath, gaslight sconces. Actual gaslight, I realized with a jolt. Cast shadows that pooled in the corners. The smell reminded me of opening my grandfather's lake cabin after a winter sealed shut. Mildew and pine sol fighting a war neither would win, with an antiseptic undertone that made my sinuses ache. She recited the estate's history as we walked. Built 1889 by Silver Baron Leopold Whitlock. Tuberculosis sanatorium in the 20s. Private asylum in the 50s. Rehabilitation center since 1987. The hydrotherapy wing had been closed since an accident some years ago. I was not to enter it under any circumstances. She delivered this information without inflection, without turning to verify I was following, her slight limp favoring her left leg in a manner that suggested old injury rather than temporary ailment. We climbed the staircase. The boards creaked in a sequence that sounded almost melodic, and I found myself counting steps to avoid thinking about the portraits lining the corridor, the white paint obscuring their subjects' faces in a way that suggested not vandalism but ritual. My room was small, austere, unfurnished except for an iron bed frame, a wooden chair, and a dresser missing 2 of its drawers. A single window looked out onto the inner courtyard, where snow had accumulated around a dry fountain. The stone cherub at its center cracked vertically from crown to base. The radiator clanked, but produced no heat. I set my bag on the chair and sat on the bed, which sagged alarmingly under my weight, and pressed my palms against my temples. Withdrawal had begun in earnest 3 days ago. I had timed my last drink carefully, knowing that arriving drunk would be grounds for expulsion, knowing that I needed the program to satisfy the court, to salvage whatever fragments of my medical license might remain salvageable. But I had miscalculated the severity. The tremors had progressed from my hands to my entire body. I was sweating through my clothes despite the cold. And the perceptual disturbances, peripheral movement where there should be none, sounds that seemed to originate inside my skull, these were intensifying. I was examining the radiator, trying to determine if it could be made functional, when I heard the footsteps in the hallway, heavy, deliberate. They paused outside my door. I waited for a knock that did not come. Instead, the footsteps resumed, receding down the corridor, and in their wake I heard something else, a wet, dragging sound, as though something sodden was being pulled across the floorboards. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty. But there, extending from where the footsteps had paused, was a trail of water, not a few drops, a continuous line of moisture, darkening the wood, leading toward the stairwell. I crouched and touched it. Cold, faintly brackish. My fingers came away gritty with sediment. I should have returned to my room. Instead, I followed the trail to the stairs, down 2 flights, along a corridor I had not seen during the initial tour. The water led to a door marked hydrotherapy, authorized personnel only. The door was padlocked, but the water continued underneath it, seeping from the gap beneath. I pressed my ear to the wood and heard, faint but unmistakable, the sound of dripping, rhythmic, patient, and beneath it, something else. A sound like breathing, but wrong in tempo, too slow, as if each inhalation required immense effort. A voice behind me. "You're not supposed to be down here." I turned. A man stood at the end of the corridor, hands in his pockets, expression neutral. He was perhaps 50, with the lean build of someone who had once been athletic and was now merely thin. His hair was silver, cut short, and his eyes had the particular clarity of the recently sober. He wore civilian clothes, dark trousers, a wool sweater, which marked him as a patient rather than staff. I gestured at the floor where the water had been, but it had vanished. The wood was dry, undisturbed. I looked at my fingers. No grit. No moisture. He explained that hallucinations were common during the first week, the brain's protest against sobriety. It would pass. When I told him I was a surgeon, that I understood the physiological mechanisms of withdrawal, he smiled with a sadness that suggested he knew exactly where surgeons end up when the board yanks their privileges. He introduced himself as Victor Dalton, former attorney, former husband, former believer in the rule of law. Victor offered a slight nod of acknowledgement. I felt the relief of human presence after days of isolation, and with it, a rush of gratitude that made me ashamed. Victor informed me that there were only 12 of us here at present, that everyone already knew who I was, that if I was found near the hydrotherapy wing, Dr. Kessler would put me in isolation. I followed him back upstairs through corridors that seemed to multiply, to double back on themselves in ways that defied the building's external geometry. We emerged in a common room I had not previously encountered, a large space with high ceilings, furnished with mismatched chairs arranged in a rough circle. Several men sat scattered throughout, reading or staring at nothing. One, younger than the others, was doing push-ups in the corner with the grim focus of someone trying to exhaust himself into sleep. Another stood at the window, forehead pressed against the glass, breath fogging and clearing in a steady rhythm. Victor directed my attention to 3 men clustered near the fireplace. Brennan Ashford and his disciples, he called them. They had run a hedge fund into the ground, taken a few $100 million in client money with it, and landed here instead of prison through expensive attorneys and cooperative judges. They had decided to maintain their corporate hierarchy in exile. It made them feel less powerless. Brennan Ashford was broad-shouldered, square-jawed, and sitting in the best chair by the fireplace like he'd claimed it on arrival and dared anyone to object. He was holding court. The 2 other men arranged on either side like attendants, and when he laughed it was a sound designed to fill a room and remind you who owned it. As we entered, his gaze fixed on me with an evaluative coldness that made the hair on my neck rise. He called across the room, announcing fresh meat, asking if I was a DUI surgeon or a pill-popping anesthesiologist. I had that shaky, guilty look, he said. Doctors who killed someone and couldn't quite believe they had to face consequences all had it. The room had gone quiet. Everyone was watching. Victor touched my elbow, a brief, steadying pressure, but said nothing. I understood that I was being tested, that my response would determine how the next weeks or months unfolded. I told him I was a cardiovascular surgeon, that I had made a mistake during a procedure, that a patient had died. My voice came out steady, which surprised me. Brennan stood and crossed the room. He was taller than I had estimated, 6'3" or 6'4", moving with the ease of someone who had never doubted his right to occupy space. He appreciated the honesty here, he said. They were all here because they had destroyed something. Careers, families, other people's trust. They had been banished to this Gothic relic to sit with what they'd broken, like medieval penitents. He explained the pecking order. He was at the top. I was at the bottom. I would do what he said, when he said it, and maybe I would get through this without additional trauma. If I caused problems, I would get problems. I should have looked away. Every instinct bred into me by medical school hierarchy, by years of deferring to senior surgeons, by the recent catastrophic education in the cost of arrogance, all of it urged submission. But something in his performance was too calculated, too rehearsed. I understand that you're frightened, I said, and that you're using aggression to manage it. For a moment, something moved behind his eyes, genuine rage, quickly suppressed. Then he smiled, and the smile was worse than the anger. He told me we were going to have fun together. He clapped me on the shoulder, hard enough to hurt, and returned to his seat by the fireplace. Victor led me to chairs on the opposite side of the room. He observed that my response had been either very brave or very stupid. He had not decided which. I asked if Brennan actually hurt people. Victor explained that psychologically, yes. Physically, not directly. But he had cultivated a following, and some of them were less restrained. The staff were overworked, understaffed, fundamentally indifferent. Dr. Kessler ran the place like a Victorian workhouse. As long as nobody died or escaped, he considered his job done. That created a vacuum, and Brennan had filled it. Victor told me about a patient 6 months ago who had challenged Brennan. A quiet fellow who kept to himself. One night, someone poured bleach in his shampoo bottle, caustic burns across his scalp, skin peeling in his sheets. He was transferred to a medical facility, and the investigation concluded it was self-inflicted. I would need to be careful, Victor said, especially during group therapy. That was where Brennan really performed. Group therapy occurred daily at 4 in the afternoon in a room whose windows had been painted black. We sat in a circle on folding metal chairs while Dr. Roland Kessler, the facility director, presided with a clipboard and an expression of profound boredom. Kessler was a small, neat man in his 60s, with wire-rimmed glasses and the manner of someone who had long ago exhausted his capacity for empathy. He opened each session by asking if anyone wished to share, and when no one volunteered, he would select someone at random. On my third day, he selected me. I had prepared for this. I had rehearsed the narrative until it had the smooth, impersonal quality of a case presentation. I described the surgery, the error, the death. I used medical terminology as a shield, distancing myself through precision. I did not mention the drinking. Kessler, of course, mentioned it for me. He asked if I had a problem with alcohol. I told him I had made a serious error in judgment. That's not what I asked. Across the circle, Brennan was watching with the avid attention of a spectator at a blood sport. Pressure built behind my eyes, the familiar tightness in my chest that signaled the onset of panic. I had been sober for 12 days. The withdrawal symptoms were subsiding, but in their wake was something worse. A vast, empty clarity, an exposure of the mechanisms I had been using to avoid thinking. I admitted I did not know if I had a problem. Kessler wrote something on his clipboard and moved on to another patient. The session continued for 90 minutes, each man in turn offering his rehearsed confession, his performance of contrition. Brennan spoke at length about market forces and systemic failures, never once using the first person, never once acknowledging that he had made choices. When he finished, Kessler nodded approvingly and marked something on his chart. The sessions followed a pattern. Kessler would identify weakness, shame, guilt, fear, and would probe it until the subject broke down or became defensive. Either response was treated as progress. Resistance was pathologized. Submission was rewarded with Kessler's tepid approval and the temporary suspension of attention. I learned to perform adequately. I learned the vocabulary of recovery, the rhetoric of personal responsibility tempered with compassion for the suffering self. I learned to cry on schedule, to speak about my wound in language that suggested insight without requiring genuine excavation. It was not difficult. I had spent years in medical training learning to present confidence I did not feel, to speak with authority on subjects I barely understood, to perform the role of physician until the performance became indistinguishable from identity. But the sessions left me hollow, scraped out. In the evenings, I would return to my room and lie on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling where water stains had formed patterns that resembled faces. And I would feel the emptiness expanding inside me like a pressure differential, a vacuum that pulled at my edges. On the 7th night, I woke to the sound of scratching. It came from inside the walls, directly behind my headboard, a frantic, rhythmic sound. Nails on plaster, or something harder, something that left grooves. I sat up, the scratching loud enough I could feel it in my teeth, and pressed my palm against the wallpaper. The scratching stopped immediately, as though whatever made it had felt my touch and gone still. I waited. The radiator ticked. Outside wind moved through the pines with a sound like surf. Then the scratching resumed, moving laterally along the wall, following the path toward the window. I got out of bed and followed the sound, pressing my ear to the plaster at intervals. The scratching led to the corner, then down, then stopped at the baseboard. I knelt and examined the seam where a wall met floor. The baseboard was warped, pulling away from the plaster, and in the gap I could see something else. A smell, faint but unmistakable. Brackish water. The same smell from the trail leading to the hydrotherapy wing. I pried at the baseboard with my fingernails. It came away easily, the nails having rusted through decades ago. Behind it was a space, perhaps 4 inches deep, running the length of the wall. I retrieved my phone from the dresser and shone the light into the gap. The space was filled with water, not standing water. It was moving, flowing from left to right, with visible current, as though it were part of a hidden drainage system. But we were on the 3rd floor. There should be no water here, no pipes carrying that volume. I reached in and felt the flow, cold enough to numb my fingers instantly. And in the current, solid objects bumped against my hand. I withdrew one. It was a key, heavy and old, cast iron with an ornate head. Victorian-era construction, when locks were architectural features rather than security measures. I dried it on my shirt and examined it in the phone light. No markings, no indication of what it might open. I tried to replace the baseboard, but it would not fit properly. The water had warped the wood beyond repair. I left it propped against the wall and returned to bed, the key gripped in my fist, and did not sleep for the remainder of the night. At breakfast, a communal affair in a dining hall whose ceiling was collapsing in slow motion, chunks of plaster held in place by yellowed paint. I sat with Victor and showed him the key. He examined it briefly, then returned it without comment. "The building is full of locked doors," he said. "Most of them are better left that way, but—" I noticed that his hand trembled slightly as he lifted his coffee, and that he did not meet my eyes. The supernatural phenomena escalated with a methodical quality that suggested less haunting than experiment. On the 8th night, I found wet footprints leading from the hallway into my room, crossing the floor to stand beside my bed, then returning to the door. The prints were large, adult male, and each one was surrounded by a dark sediment that smelled of deep water and rot. I photographed them with my phone, but when I checked the images, they showed only bare floorboards. On the 9th night, I heard the breathing again, slow, labored, originating from behind the wall where the baseboard had been removed. I pressed my ear to the gap and heard not just breathing, but something else beneath it, a voice or voices, speaking in a rhythm that suggested conversation, but with no words I could distinguish. When I tried to record it, the phone captured only static. On the 10th night, I saw the figure. I had been lying awake, watching the window where moonlight filtered through the pines outside, when movement drew my attention to the corner of the room. A shape stood there, man-sized, utterly still. It was too dark to distinguish features, but I could see the outline, head, shoulders, arms hanging at its sides, and I could hear it breathing. That same slow, effortful respiration, each inhalation taking 5 seconds, each exhalation the same. I did not move. We remained like that for what might have been minutes or hours. Then the shape moved. Not walked, but seemed to shift position without transition, and was suddenly beside the bed, standing where the footprints had stood, close enough that I should have been able to reach out and touch it. The smell of brackish water intensified until I could taste it. And now I could see details. The shape was humanoid, but wrong, the proportions distorted, the surface glistening as though perpetually wet. It leaned toward me, and I saw its face, or where a face should have been. There was only shadow there, and the suggestion of features dissolving, of flesh that had spent too long submerged and was coming apart. I tried to scream, my throat locked. The figure remained bent over me, and I could feel coldness radiating from it. The temperature drop you get opening a walk-in freezer, that immediate skin prickle at 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Then it was gone. The room was empty. I was alone, gasping, my shirt soaked through with sweat. When I turned on the light, there was nothing. No footprints, no water, no evidence of intrusion. But on the floor beside the bed, written in that same dark sediment, were 2 words: "Find me." I did not return to sleep. When dawn came, I went directly to Victor's room and told him everything. He listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. And when I finished, he stood and crossed to his window, looking out at the courtyard where the broken cherub presided over frozen nothing. "The patient who drowned," he said finally. His name was Victor Dalton. I stared at him. "But you're—" "I know what I am." He turned from the window, and in the morning light I saw something I had not noticed before, a translucence to his skin, a quality that suggested he was not entirely there, not entirely solid. I died here 10 years ago, in the hydrotherapy pool. I've been trying to leave ever since. The room tilted. I gripped the door frame to keep from falling, my medical training offering explanations. Psychotic break, a withdrawal-induced hallucination, dissociative fugue state. But none of them landed. What I was seeing, what I was hearing, had a coherence that delusion lacked. "You were a securities lawyer," I said, my voice strange in my own ears. Victor's translucence flickered. "I was a lot of things, and you came here because I had a phone." He stopped, started again. "Because I thought I was smarter than the investigation. Because I thought if I could just hide the evidence for 6 months, my attorneys could work the system and I could walk." "What was on the phone?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, "You remember the pool cover?" I shook my head. "You will," he said. Victor's story emerged in fragments over the next hour, interrupted by my questions, by long silences where he seemed to be deciding what he could say and what would break me. He had been a securities lawyer, successful, arrogant, convinced of his own cleverness. He had gotten involved in a scheme, insider trading, market manipulation. The exact details no longer mattered. When the investigation began, he had come here to avoid prosecution, to buy time while his attorneys worked the system. But he had not come alone. He had brought insurance, a waterproof phone containing evidence that would have exonerated him, that would have proven he was merely a fall guy for bigger players. The phone was his way out. He just needed to keep it safe until the moment was right. The hydrotherapy wing was off limits, shuttered after a previous accident, but Victor had found a way in. Late one night he had taken the phone down to the pool room, thinking the space was abandoned, secure. He had been examining the pool, an enormous Art Deco construction, 20 feet deep at one end, when he realized that the phone would be safer at the bottom, weighted down, hidden in the filtration grate, where no search would find it. He had placed it in a waterproof container and dropped it into the deep end. Then he had gone in after it to make sure it settled correctly, to make sure it was truly hidden. "While I was at the bottom," Victor said, his voice flat now, empty of inflection. The pool cover engaged. It was a massive steel apparatus, automated, designed to slide over the pool's surface for safety and temperature control. It weighed over 1,000 pounds. When it began to move, Victor was 15 feet underwater, and by the time he reached the surface, the cover was already 2/3 closed. He had tried to swim out through the narrowing gap. He had almost made it. His fingers had touched the edge of the deck, but the cover had caught him at the shoulders, and the mechanism, designed to detect resistance and stop, had malfunctioned. It had kept sliding, and Victor, trapped in the closing vise, had been pulled back underwater as the cover sealed completely. He paused then, and I watched him fade slightly, his outline blurring at the edges. "The part about drowning they don't tell you," he said, "is how long it takes, how each second expands, how your body fights even after your mind has given up." He told me about the steel ceiling overhead, about the water filling his lungs in a way that was not quick, not merciful, but something that went on far too long, each moment stretching into hours. And when he finally stopped struggling, when his body went still and sank to the bottom, he had not died, not entirely. Some part of him remained, tethered to the building, to the unfinished business of that phone. That evidence, that proof of his innocence that would never be recovered. "I've been here ever since," he said, "watching patients come and go, waiting. And then you arrived. Why me? Because you're like me." He moved closer, and I could see through him now, could see the wall behind him, showing faintly through his chest. "You've done something you can't forgive yourself for. You're trapped in your own version of this. And maybe if I can help you find your way out, I can find mine." The reasoning was spectral logic, the desperate bargaining of the dead. But I was beyond questioning. I was standing in a room with a ghost who wore the face of my only friend in this place, and the horror of it was indistinguishable from relief. I was not insane. The phenomena were real. I was being haunted. Victor told me what he needed. The phone, recovered from the pool, powered on to complete his unfinished business. The evidence displayed, even if no one but us ever saw it. The symbolic completion of the task he had died attempting. If I could do that, he believed his spirit would be released. He could move on. He could stop being whatever he had become. I asked how I was supposed to get into the hydrotherapy wing. It was locked, off-limits patrolled. Victor smiled, and in that smile I saw both gratitude and something else. Something that might have been pity. "You already have the key," he said. "You found it behind the wall. Everything you need has been provided. You just have to be willing to go down there." The key was in my pocket. I had been carrying it since the night I found it, a talisman against the dark. I withdrew it and held it up to the light. Iron, old, ornate. It had come from the water in the walls, delivered to me by mechanisms I did not understand and could not question. "Tonight," Victor said. "After midnight, when the staff do their rounds, I'll show you the way." I spent the afternoon in a state of dissociated calm, moving through group therapy and dinner and the evening common room period, with the surface attention of someone whose consciousness was focused elsewhere. Brennan attempted to provoke me during therapy, made a comment about surgeons playing God, about how we killed people and called it medicine. But I did not rise to it. I was no longer inhabiting the same reality as him. I was operating on a different frequency, where ghosts gave instructions and antique keys promised access to flooded tombs. Victor sat across the circle, and now that I knew what he was, I could see the signs everywhere. How other patients' gazes passed over him without quite focusing. How he never ate, never drank, only sat with his hands folded and watched. The translucence that I had attributed to the facility's poor lighting, but which was actually the fading coherence of a consciousness untethered from flesh. At 11:30, I lay in bed fully clothed, the key in my hand, waiting. The building settled around me with its repertoire of creaks and groans, the gaslight sconces in the hallway dimming and brightening in rhythm with some fluctuation in pressure I did not want to consider. At 11:50 I heard footsteps, the night orderly making his rounds, checking that we were all secured in our rooms like specimens in a collection. At midnight exactly, Victor appeared in my doorway. He did not knock, did not open the door. He simply manifested there, more transparent than before, his edges beginning to blur. It's time. I followed him into the hallway, down the main stairs, through corridors I had walked before, but which looked different at night, the walls seeming to lean inward. the portraits with their painted-over faces turning to follow our progress. We descended to the ground floor, then lower, into a basement level I had not known existed. The temperature dropped with each step. I could feel it through my jacket, that immediate skin prickle, at 38 degrees Fahrenheit turning to something colder, 32 degrees Fahrenheit and falling. Our breath, mine at least. Victor produced no vapor, formed clouds that lingered. The gaslight did not extend down here. Victor moved through the black with the assurance of someone who no longer required sight, and I followed with my phone's flashlight, the beam cutting tunnels through shadow. We reached the hydrotherapy wing through a service corridor. Victor stopped before a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only," the same door I had found on my first night, but approached from a different direction, from below rather than from the main floor. "The key," Victor said. I fitted it into the lock. It turned with a smoothness that belied its age, the mechanism engaging with a sound like an indrawn breath. The door swung inward on hinges that should have been rusted solid, but which moved in perfect silence. Beyond was black like the inside of a freezer bag, the kind that still smells like fish, even after you've washed it 3 times. My flashlight seemed dim, the beam swallowed after penetrating only a few feet. Victor stepped through first, and I saw him more clearly in the blackness than I had in the relative light of the corridor, as though shadow was his natural medium, where he became more real rather than less. The hydrotherapy wing was vast. As my eyes adjusted, I began to distinguish shapes. A row of porcelain tubs along one wall, each large enough to submerge a human body completely, fitted with apparatus whose purpose I could only guess at. Leather restraints hanging from hooks, wheeled gurneys with drainage holes, and at the far end, through an archway, the pool. It was Art Deco, as Victor had described, but on a scale I had not imagined. The chamber housing it was 2 stories high, with a vaulted ceiling and walls tiled in blue and white geometric patterns. The pool itself stretched 40 feet in length, its surface covered by the steel apparatus that had killed Victor, a massive sheet of metal suspended on tracks, currently retracted to one side, leaving the pool open. But the pool was not full. It had been drained, the deep end descending 15 feet to a tiled bottom where debris had accumulated. Leaves, plaster, the mummified corpse of a bird. The filtration grates were visible as dark squares at the lowest point. Victor stood at the edge, looking down into the empty basin. In the reflected light from my phone, I could see through him completely now. I could see the tile pattern on the far wall showing through his torso. "It's down there," he said, pointing to the filtration grate at the pool's deepest point, in the left grate. I wedged it in, made sure it would stay. 10 years and it's still there. Waiting. I approached the edge and looked down. The descent was steep, the tiles slick with algae despite the absence of water. There was a ladder at the shallow end, but it was rusted, several rungs missing. The deep end offered no such convenience. I would have to climb down 20 feet or more, with nothing to arrest the fall. "I'll go with you," Victor said, "as far as I can." We descended together, Victor drifting more than climbing, myself gripping the pool's edge and lowering myself over, my feet searching for purchase on the slick tiles. The air in the pool was different. Heavier, damper, tasting of minerals and decay. Sound behaved strangely, my breathing echoing in multiple registers, as though the space had acoustic properties that had nothing to do with its physical dimensions. I reached the bottom. The filtration grates were set flush with the tile, each covered with a metal grill secured by screws that had corroded into irregular lumps. I knelt before the left grate and examined it. The screws were beyond salvaging, but the grill itself had warped, pulling away from the frame at one corner. I worked my fingers into the gap and pulled. The grill came away with a screech of protesting metal. Behind it was a cavity, perhaps 2 feet deep, descending into the building's infrastructure. The smell that emerged was profound. Stagnant water, rust, rotting matter left in the dark. I shone my light into the opening and saw, wedged between pipes, a waterproof document case. Trial exhibit quality, expensive leather with brass clasps. I reached in, my arm submerged to the shoulder in the cold, wet shadow, and my fingers closed on rubberized fabric. I withdrew the case. It was intact, sealed, covered in sediment that came away in sheets when I wiped it. Inside was a manila folder, and inside the folder, photographs. Dozens of them, printed on waterproof photo paper, each one protected by a plastic sleeve. Financial documents, spreadsheets, email printouts, all carefully photographed for preservation. Victor had drifted closer. He was watching with an intensity that made him more visible, as though his attention had mass, had presence. "Look at them," he said. "Look at what I saved." I spread the photographs on the pool floor, arranging them in the beam of my flashlight. Victor guided me through them. Messages, spreadsheets, recorded call transcripts. What mattered was near the bottom of the stack, he said. The personal documentation he had compiled. And there, beneath the evidence, were photos I had not expected. Photos of the facility. Of the hydrotherapy pool when it still held water. Of Victor himself, younger, standing at the pool's edge with the document case in his hands. And in the final photograph, another man, standing in shadow near the pool controls, his face partially visible. My face. I was looking at a photograph of myself from 10 years ago, standing in this room beside this pool. I was smiling. My hand was on the control panel. And in the bottom corner of the image, written in Victor's handwriting on the white border, "Partner, night of." The case slipped from my hand, photographs scattering on the tile. I stared at Victor, who was no longer transparent but fully visible. More solid than he had been since I met him, his skin gray and bloated, water streaming from his hair, his clothes pooling at his feet. "You remember now," he said. It was not a question, and I did. The memories were arriving not in sequence but in fragments, shards of awareness that cut as they surfaced. I had been here before, not as a patient but as Victor's partner. We had been running a smuggling operation. Pills, stolen from hospital pharmacies, repackaged and sold through offshore networks. Victor had handled the legal infrastructure and the shell corporations. I had provided the medical access, the prescriptions, the appearance of legitimacy. When the investigation began, we had both run here. Not to the same facility by coincidence, but together, deliberately, using falsified records to establish our presence as court-mandated rehabilitation rather than fugitive hiding. We had thought we were clever. We had thought we were safe. But I had started using our own product. The pills had turned on me, had transformed from profit margin to necessity. And Victor, watching me deteriorate, had begun to question the partnership, had begun to suggest that perhaps we should surrender, cooperate, take our chances with the legal system. I could not allow that. Too much was at stake. My career, my freedom, my elaborately constructed identity as a respected surgeon rather than a criminal. So I had made a decision. The night Victor went into the pool, I had been there. I had watched him descend, had seen him place the document case in the grate. And when he surfaced, when he swam toward the edge, I had gone to the control panel. I had not touched it. I had not needed to. I had simply stood there, my hand hovering over the emergency override, and I had wanted the cover to engage. I had willed it with such intensity that the mechanism, old, temperamental, prone to malfunction, had responded. The pool cover had begun to slide. I had watched it slide shut. I had heard him scream, had seen his fingers scrabbling at the steel. I had stood there for 45 minutes, listening to the sounds grow weaker, until there was only silence. Then I had left. I had walked out of the facility that same night, returned to my life and my mind. Already fracturing under the narcotic assault of the pills, had done what minds do when confronted with unbearable guilt. It had rewritten the narrative. It had fabricated a different story, one where I was a surgeon who made an error, who killed through negligence rather than intention. One where I was victim rather than perpetrator. The surgical error, the dead accountant, the court-mandated rehabilitation. All of it was false. I had constructed an elaborate fiction to avoid confronting what I actually was. "You killed me," Victor said. His voice was different now. No longer the calm, cynical tone of the friend I had known, but something colder. Something that had spent a decade underwater learning patience. "You murdered me, and then you forgot. You went on with your life while I stayed here, trapped, unable to move on because my business was unfinished. And my business was you." I tried to speak. My throat had closed. The pool seemed to be contracting, the walls pressing inward, though I knew that was impossible. "I've been waiting," Victor continued, "waiting for you to come back, waiting for the guilt to eat through your constructed reality, waiting for you to return to the scene, and you did. Your mind brought you back here, created a scenario that would land you in this exact facility, in this exact situation. Because some part of you knows, some part of you has always known what you did." Above, I heard the machinery engage, not the grinding of gears or the shriek of activation, but something else, a sound like a breath being drawn in, like the building itself sighing. The pool cover began to slide closed, the massive steel sheet moving along its tracks with a sound like thunder in a tunnel. The opening was narrowing, the light from above being cut off in increments. "What are you doing?" My voice came out as a whisper. Victor smiled. Water streamed from his mouth. "Finishing my business. The unfinished business was never about the evidence and about clearing my name. It was about you, about making sure you understood, about making sure you were here at the bottom when the cover closed." I ran for the ladder, but my feet went out from under me on the slick tiles. I fell hard, my head striking the pool floor, stars blooming in my vision. By the time I regained my feet, the cover was 3/4 closed, the gap above narrowed to a strip of dim light. I could see Victor standing at the pool's edge, at the shallow end near where the controls were mounted, but his hands were at his sides. He was not touching the panel. He was simply standing there, watching as the machinery completed its work. Gears and tracks and 1,000 pounds of steel doing exactly what they'd been designed to do. "You stood exactly where I'm standing," he said. "You watched me drown, and now I'll return the favor. Not with water. There's no water anymore. But with this, with the knowledge of what you did, with endless time to think about it, trapped at the bottom where I was trapped. The cover sealed completely. The sound of its locking mechanism engaging was final, absolute. I was in blackness, the kind you get in a mine shaft when your headlamp dies and you realize how far underground you actually are. The oxygen was already growing stale, consumed by my panicked breathing. I screamed. I beat my fists against the steel above me, but it was like striking bedrock. I found the ladder and climbed, pressing my shoulder against the cover, trying to force it open, but 1,000 pounds of steel does not yield to human strength. I do not know how long I stood there, screaming into the black. Eventually, my voice gave out. Eventually, I sank to the bottom of the pool and sat with my back against the tiles, the scattered photographs still clutched in one hand. the evidence of my crime, the proof of what I had done. Above me, I could hear footsteps on the deck. Victor walking the perimeter. Patient. He had eternity. I had only whatever air remained in the sealed chamber. I gathered the photographs in the shadow, feeling their edges, and looked at the one image I could still see in my mind. Myself from 10 years ago, standing beside the pool controls, smiling. That man was a stranger. I did not recognize him, could not connect him to the person I believed myself to be. But the evidence was irrefutable. I had been here. I had done this. And I understood finally what Victor had meant about unfinished business. His business was not about being exonerated. It was about ensuring that I would spend whatever time remained to me understanding what I had taken from him. That I would know, with absolute clarity, the weight of my crime. My breathing had become labored, each inhalation bringing less. Carbon dioxide was building in the sealed space, and soon I would slip into unconsciousness. Death would follow shortly after. Quiet, undramatic, respiratory function simply ceasing. I found myself grateful for that. Grateful that it would not involve water, would not involve the suffocating panic of drowning. Victor had given me that mercy at least, or perhaps it was not mercy but practicality. The pool had been drained, there was no water. He could only kill me with what was available. Above, I heard the sound of the cover beginning to retract. The steel groaned, tracks shrieking, and a line of light appeared, widening slowly. Fresh air flooded in, cold and sharp, and I gasped at it, my lungs spasmodic. The cover continued opening until it was fully retracted, leaving the pool exposed. I looked up at the edge of the deck and saw Victor standing there, still bloated and dripping, his skin gray in the dim light. He gazed down at me for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps receding. I did not move. I sat at the bottom of the pool, breathing air that tasted of decay and liberation, and understood that this was not mercy either. Victor had not released me. He had simply ensured that I would survive, would return to the surface, would carry the knowledge of what I had done back into the world. The pool was no longer my tomb. It was my confessional. I do not know how long I remained there before I finally climbed the ladder and emerged into the hydrotherapy wing. The facility was silent, the hour deep in the night between midnight and dawn. I walked through the corridors with the photographs still in my hand, the evidence, the proof, the irrefutable record. When I reached my room, I sat on the bed and examined them one final time in the gaslight from the hallway. I scrolled through the documentation of crimes I had committed and then forgotten, and I understood that I had a choice. I could destroy the photographs. I could continue the fiction, could walk out of this facility when my mandated time was complete and return to whatever remained of my life. No one knew the truth except Victor, and Victor was dead. I could carry the knowledge privately, could fashion it into whatever shape allowed me to function. Or I could turn the evidence over to the authorities, could confess everything. The smuggling, the murder, the decade of constructed amnesia, could accept whatever consequences followed. I sat holding the photographs until dawn began to show through the window, then I placed them in the dresser drawer and closed it. Outside my window, the first light of dawn was beginning to show through the pines. In the courtyard below, the broken cherub presided over its frozen fountain, cracked vertically from crown to base, patient and eternal. I looked at my hands, the hands that had murdered Victor Dalton, that had performed surgeries on patients who trusted me with their lives. They were steady now, the tremors of withdrawal having finally ceased. And I understood, with a clarity that was worse than any horror Victor had shown me, that I would do nothing. I would not confess. I would not turn myself in. I would finish my time here, would return to my life, and would find a way to continue. Because that was what I had always done. That was what I was. The pool had not changed me. The revelation had not redeemed me. I was exactly what I had always been. A man who chose survival over truth, comfort over justice, the maintenance of self-image over acknowledgement of sin. Victor had shown me the depths of my corruption, and I had looked into them and chosen to climb out and walk away. That was the real horror. Not the ghost, not the supernatural phenomena, not the locked pool or the suffocation. The real horror was the knowledge that I would go on living, would carry this truth the way the fountain carries its crack, visible to anyone who looks. But I'd learned to stand so people looked elsewhere. I set the photographs in the dresser drawer and lay back on the bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling where the patterns resembled faces, watching, judging, bearing eternal witness. Outside, something moved in the courtyard. I sat up and looked out the window. Victor stood beside the fountain, his hand on the broken cherub's head. He was looking up at my window. Our eyes met across the distance. He did not move, did not gesture. He simply stood there, watching. And I understood that he would always be there. That even when I left this place, even when I returned to the world and reconstructed my life again, he would be watching, bearing witness to what I was and what I had chosen to remain. I closed my eyes, but when I did, I saw him exactly where he'd been standing, beside the cherub, hand on its broken head, patient as the limestone he'd drowned under. The radiator ticked, the building settled, and far below, in the drain pool where Victor Dalton had drowned, water began to drip from an unknown source, each drop echoing up through the infrastructure like a heartbeat that would not stop. Claire had learned to catalog exits before she learned to ride a bicycle. 28 years of her mother's instructions had compressed into reflex. The weight of a stranger's gaze, the placement of hands, the distinct quality of footsteps behind her. She maintained these calculations without conscious thought now, the way other women checked their phones or adjusted their hair. The skill had kept her safe, she believed, through university in Leeds, through 3 years in London, through every night walk home when the tube stopped running and the minicab queue stretched too long to bear. Her mother had been a librarian in Harrogate, a woman who arranged the world into taxonomies of threat and safety. Young Claire had learned to read the systems, which streets to avoid, which types of men posed which types of danger, how to position her body to suggest confidence without aggression. The lessons had seemed excessive then, sitting in their kitchen with its view of the orderly back garden, but London had proven them essential. Or so Claire told herself each time she successfully navigated another night alone, another train platform, another stretch of empty pavement. The fog had settled thick between the buildings tonight, turning the street lamps into smudged suggestions of light. Her shoes made clean, discreet sounds against the pavement. Good shoes, leather, purchased specifically for the quality of their tread. She had already mapped this route. 4 blocks of shuttered shops and empty office buildings, then the residential streets where lighted windows promised witnesses. The architecture here dated from the 1930s, all clean lines and that characteristic English optimism about the future, before the future arrived and proved more complicated than geometric forms could contain. She walked quickly, but not so quickly as to suggest fear. Her keys nestled between her knuckles in her right coat pocket, positioned for use as a weapon. middle finger through the largest key, the jagged edges protruding like small knives. This was another of her mother's innovations, demonstrated on the kitchen table with patient instruction. The quarterly reports meeting had run past 9. Her manager had apologized, but not enough to offer cab fare, and Claire had learned not to request what wouldn't be freely given. The tube would have been crowded at this hour. Friday night, people pressed together in forced intimacy. But the alternative of this walk had seemed preferable. She'd taken this route a dozen times before without incident. The financial district emptied after dark, but it was well lit, the buildings imposing enough to suggest security even in their vacancy. Tonight felt different only because of the fog, and because the meeting had run later than usual, and because she was more tired than she'd admitted to herself. The variables had aligned in an unusual way, not fate, not destiny, just the ordinary chaos of urban life producing an unexpected combination. The man appeared at the corner of East Cheap and Philpott Lane. He stood beneath the malfunctioning traffic signal, the one that cycled red, amber, green for no one, and he was looking at the sky. His suit appeared expensive, but rumpled, as though he had slept in it, or as though it had been expensive a decade ago and he had worn it every day since. The fabric showed that telltale sheen that wool developed when the weave began to separate. His collar was open, no tie. His face was tilted upward at an angle that suggested religious ecstasy or neurological damage, but it was his mouth that triggered the alert system in Claire's brainstem. The grin stretched impossibly wide, showing teeth all the way back to the molars. It bore no relation to anything she understood as human pleasure. The expression seemed to require more facial muscles than anatomy allowed. It looked like something wearing a smile the way a costume might wear skin, something that had studied the mechanics of joy without comprehending its essence. He began to move, not walking, dancing. A waltz, she realized, though the recognition felt obscene. His arms curved around an invisible partner with tender precision. His right hand hovered at shoulder-blade height, supporting nothing. His left hand extended at exactly the angle required to hold another person's hand. His feet traced a perfect box step across the pavement. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. His head tilted at an angle that suggested he might be listening to music she couldn't hear, but his eyes remained fixed on the empty air before him, gazing at a face that wasn't there. The grin never wavered. He was moving toward her. Claire's mother had taught her that the appearance of irrationality was itself a threat. Unpredictable men were dangerous men. Men who followed their own logic could not be negotiated with, could not be reasoned out of whatever narrative they had constructed. The statistics on violence by mentally ill strangers versus violence by known acquaintances were irrelevant when you were alone on an empty street with only one data point. She measured the distance between them, approximately 40 meters, and the time it would take him to close that gap at his current pace, perhaps 90 seconds. The shops on either side stood dark. The offices above them darker still. She crossed the street. The movement was smooth, unhurried. She didn't run. Running suggested prey, and prey triggered pursuit. She simply angled her trajectory to create more distance, maintaining her pace, keeping him in her peripheral vision. Her heart rate elevated precisely as it should, alertness, not panic. Her breathing remained steady. Her mother's voice, always her mother's voice. You can't outrun a determined man, but you can outthink him. Make him work for his advantage. Make him reveal himself. The dancing man crossed the street. His box step never faltered. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. He adjusted his trajectory to mirror hers with balletic precision. His invisible partner held close, his grin fixed in what might have been ecstasy or anguish or something for which there was no adequate word in any language Claire knew. The fog shifted around him, parting and closing. His polished shoes struck the pavement with metronomic precision. The sound carried in the muffled air with unusual clarity. Claire's breathing remained controlled through the conscious effort now rather than natural rhythm. She accelerated incrementally, a pace that could still pass for purpose rather than flight. Her fingers tightened on the keys until the metal bit into her palm. She inventoried her surroundings with the efficiency of long practice. A rubbish bin bolted to the pavement, a Royal Mail postbox painted its traditional red, a bicycle rack empty of bicycles. Nothing that could serve as barrier or weapon. Nothing to put between herself and whatever narrative the grinning man was enacting. The nearest police call box stood 3 blocks north, but 3 blocks might as well be 3 miles if he closed the distance. She had her mobile phone in her bag, but she would need to stop moving to retrieve it, to unlock it, to dial. 3 locks against a dead phone and an occupied driver. The math was obvious. He was closing the distance. His waltz had accelerated to match her increased pace. Still exact. Still contained within the formal structure of the dance, each step executed with the exactitude of someone who had learned the movements so thoroughly that they had become involuntary. But faster now. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. His shoes tapped a rhythm that seemed to come from inside her own skull, syncing with her pulse. She risked a glance back. 30 meters. His face showed no awareness of her specifically. His eyes gazed at whatever vision his fractured mind had conjured. A ballroom, perhaps, or a wedding reception, or simply the remembered face of someone who had once mattered to him. But his trajectory remained unerring. Whatever internal compass guided him, it pointed directly at her position. Claire's throat had gone dry. Copper taste flooded her mouth where she had bitten the inside of her cheek without noticing. The pain was distant, informational rather than distressing. Her body had shifted into the heightened state her mother had called useful fear, the kind that sharpened perception rather than clouding it. Her mother's instructions had covered this scenario in its essential form, if not its specific details. When evasion fails, seek shelter. Find light. Find other people. Force the predator to reveal himself in a space where revelation carried consequences. The street offered no such space. The buildings stood indifferent, their windows reflecting nothing but fog and the sickly yellow of the street lamps. A black cab passed, its light off, the driver's face carefully blank in the way London cab drivers perfected to avoid unwanted fares. Claire might have run into the street, might have forced him to stop, but the dancing man was closing the gap, and the calculation had shifted. If she broke her pace, to flag the cab, to step off the pavement into the roadway, he would reach her before she could open the door. The conclusion was simple and devastating. She needed a decision. The fog obscured everything beyond 15 meters. The dancing man's footsteps maintained their terrible rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Closer. The sound had begun to feel like it was coming from inside her own body, as though her heart had adopted his cadence, as though the boundary between her consciousness and his had become permeable. Her fingers found her phone in her bag. She pulled it free without looking down, without breaking stride. The screen lit at her touch. She swiped to unlock it, her thumb moving through the pattern automatically. She pulled up the emergency dial screen, but she would need to stop to speak, to explain, to convince someone that this was real and urgent, and not the paranoia of a woman walking alone who saw threats in shadows. Then she saw the diner. It sat wedged between a shuttered travel agent and a discount chemist, an establishment she wouldn't have noticed in daylight, a relic from another era, all chrome and formica, and that peculiar patina of wear that suggested either stubborn survival or imminent collapse. The sign above the door read, "Stella's," in faded red letters, half of them burned out. But a light burned inside, a single fluorescent bar, harsh and steady, throwing stark shadows across the checkered floor, visible through the plate glass window. The only light on this entire block. The only suggestion of human presence in 4 streets of shuttered darkness. Claire would later understand how carefully that singularity had been calculated. One light, not many. Enough to suggest safety without suggesting business. A light that said, "Someone is here, but they are alone, and they might help you." She could see a man behind the counter, elderly. Gray hair combed neatly back from a high forehead. He wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows. He was wiping down the counter surface with systematic strokes, the cloth moving in small circles, his expression one of complete absorption in the simple task. She could hear his breathing now, or thought she could. A wet, labored sound that might have been real or might have been her own pulse, amplified and distorted by the fog. She stopped counting distance and started counting heartbeats. Claire ran. She abandoned all pretense of composure and sprinted, her bag slamming against her hip with each stride, her keys gouging the soft flesh of her palm. The dancing man's pace shifted instantly. She heard it without looking back. The waltz accelerating, shoes striking pavement with increased tempo, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. The rhythm collapsing into something urgent and hungry, losing its formal structure, becoming simply pursuit. Her lungs burned. Her throat had closed to a pinpoint. The fluorescent light ahead seemed to pulse with her heartbeat. The distinction between imagination and reality no longer mattered. Her shoulder hit the glass door hard enough to rattle the frame in its housing. She pounded on the window with her fist. The sound flat and desperate in the fog-muffled air, nothing like the confident knock of a legitimate customer. The elderly man looked up from his cloth. His face registered surprise, then concern. His eyebrows rose. His mouth opened slightly. Behind her, the waltz grew louder. She could feel vibrations through the pavement, or imagine she could. The dancing man was close enough now that she could hear the fabric of his suit rustling with each movement, close enough that she could smell something. Cologne mixed with sweat and something else, something sour and wrong. The lock clicked. The door opened inward, and the elderly man reached out, his hand closing on her wrist with surprising strength, and pulled her inside. She stumbled over the threshold, her bag catching on the doorframe, its contents spilling across the checkered linoleum. Lipstick, receipts, the quarterly report she'd spent the evening discussing. Her Oyster card skittered under a booth. The strength in his grip registered somewhere in the back of her mind. Not the frailty she'd expected from a man his age, but something maintained, purposeful. Someone who still worked with his hands, who lifted things, who had retained physical capability most men his age had surrendered to time and comfort. But the observation was secondary to the relief flooding her system. She was inside, safe. The dancing man was outside. The distinction felt absolute. He guided her past the counter with one hand while reaching for something with the other, a long pole with a hook on the end, the type used to pull down the old metal security shutters that shops installed before more sophisticated systems became available. He gestured for her to move back from the glass, his expression calm, reassuring. Someone who had weathered decades of small emergencies, who understood that panic rarely helped. He moved to the door, engaged 3 separate locks, deadbolt, chain, sliding bar, with practiced efficiency. The mechanisms clicked into place with sounds that should have been reassuring but somehow weren't. Then he inserted the hook into a small ring in the ceiling and pulled. The metal shutters descended with a grinding shriek, the sound of old mechanisms forced into action, cutting off the view of the street. Claire caught a final glimpse of the dancing man still approaching, his grin visible through the fog, his arm still curved around his invisible partner. Then the shutter hit the windowsill with a bang that seemed to shake the building's foundations. Claire's legs gave out. She found herself sitting on the floor, her back against the counter, her lungs burning. The copper taste in her mouth had intensified. She realized she had bitten, clear through the inside of her cheek. Blood pooled against her teeth. She swallowed it rather than spit, some residual sense of propriety maintaining itself even now. The elderly man moved past her, pulling down the shutters on the side windows with the same practiced efficiency. The pole hook caught in the ceiling rings. The metal clanged against the sills. The last slice of outside world vanished. The grinding sound stopped. The silence that followed felt absolute, as though they had descended into a space beneath the city, a pocket removed from normal geography. They were safe. They were locked in. The distinction felt important, though Claire's thoughts were still fragmenting, reassembling themselves into improper configurations. The elderly man moved behind the counter, reaching for a phone mounted on the wall near the coffee maker. It was an old rotary model, the beige plastic yellowed with age. Claire tried to form words, tried to describe what she'd just fled from, but the details came out as fragments. Rumpled suit, inappropriate grin, waltz, pursuit, faster and faster, that sound of his breathing. The elderly man nodded as though this made perfect sense, as though disturbed men chasing women through fog-bound streets was a regular occurrence requiring only routine police intervention. He lifted the phone receiver. Then he paused, his expression shifting to something like puzzlement. He tapped the receiver hook once, twice, listened. His eyebrows drew together. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. Then he jiggled the receiver hook with more force, listened again. Replaced the phone in its cradle with a careful precision. His tone remained conversational as he turned back to her, explaining that the line had failed, that he'd reported it to British Telecom weeks ago, that no one had come. He mentioned something about meaning to get a mobile phone, his daughter's suggestions, how it had never seemed necessary before. He turned to look at her fully for the first time since pulling her inside. His face remained kind, grandfatherly. The overhead fluorescent threw his wrinkles into sharp relief, emphasizing the deep lines around his eyes, the sagging flesh beneath his jaw. He smiled, a small, reassuring smile. The smile of someone trying to comfort a frightened stranger. Claire's breathing had steadied enough to allow speech. She should thank him, should explain, should apologize for disrupting his evening with her panic. But something stopped the words, some instinct that lived deeper than her mother's training. She needed to see, needed to confirm, needed to know where the threat was now. She pushed herself to standing, her legs trembling with aftershock adrenaline, and moved toward the nearest window. Her shoes stuck slightly to the linoleum. The floor needed mopping, or perhaps there was always a slight tackiness to surfaces in places like this, the accumulation of decades of spills and half-hearted cleaning. The metal shutters didn't close completely. A gap of perhaps 2 centimeters remained at the bottom, enough to allow ventilation, enough to prevent the space from becoming completely sealed, enough to allow a sliver of view to the street outside. She knelt. The tile was cold against her knees. She pressed her face to the floor, her cheek against the grime-darkened grout. The smell of old grease and industrial cleaner filled her nostrils. She looked out through the gap. The dancing man stood 20 meters down the pavement. His waltz continued, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. His invisible partner held close with that same tender precision, his smile fixed in its terrible radiance. that grin that showed too many teeth. But his trajectory had altered. He wasn't moving toward the diner. He was moving past it, parallel to the building, continuing down the street in his perfect box step. His path followed the natural line of the pavement, curving slightly where the road curved. The fog parted around him like water around a ship's prow. His polished shoes clicked their metronomic rhythm. He tilted his head as though listening to instructions from the empty air, from the invisible partner whose hand he held. Claire watched him recede. 30 meters, 40. His figure began to dissolve into the fog, the edges of his form becoming indistinct. The grin remained visible longest, that horrible bright grin hanging in the air like some obscene inversion of the Cheshire cat. Then he rounded a corner and was gone, still dancing, still holding his phantom partner close. He had never been pursuing her, had never been aware of her at all. The knowledge arrived complete and devastating. He had been dancing with someone she couldn't see, listening to music she couldn't hear, following a route laid down in his own deteriorating mind. The pursuit had existed only in her interpretation. The terror had been a product of her assessment, her training, her mother's voice, cataloging threats that weren't there. He had probably been returning from somewhere, a care home perhaps, or a son's house, wandering in his confusion through the same streets he'd walked 40 years ago when his wife was alive and they would waltz in their small kitchen on Friday nights. The smile had been joy, not menace. The dance had been a private communion with memory. His gait had matched her pace only because he was moving at the speed his body remembered, the tempo of a specific song she couldn't hear. Dennis had understood this, had probably seen the dancing man before, had learned his route, his schedule, had positioned his trap exactly where a frightened woman, fleeing from harmless strangeness, would find a light burning, would find apparent safety. One light in 4 blocks of darkness. On a night when the variables aligned, late meeting, fog, exhaustion, and a sick man dancing with ghosts along his usual path. She had fled from a sick old man dancing with ghosts. The realization produced a sensation like falling, though she was kneeling on solid tile. Her stomach dropped. Her vision narrowed to a pinpoint, then expanded again. All the adrenaline that had been sustaining her, giving her strength and clarity, suddenly had nowhere to go, no purpose to serve. It turned inward, corrosive, flooding her system with shame. She should feel relief. That's what people felt when they discovered the monster was imaginary, wasn't it? But all she felt was shame, thick and choking. She had made an old man with dementia into a predator, had imposed her fear onto his private grief, had seen danger where there was only damage, had pounded on a stranger's door in the middle of the night because a sick person was exercising what remained of their joy in the only way their fractured mind allowed. London was full of them. She'd seen them before. On the tube, in doorways, wandering through Liverpool Street Station, talking to people who weren't there. The city's mental health crisis made visible in human form. She'd always given them wide berth, but she'd never run, had never mistaken their illness for malice, until tonight. Until the fog and the lateness and her exhaustion had combined with her mother's training to transform a harmless man into a threat worthy of panic. Dennis must have watched this happen before, must have seen the pattern. A woman alone, late at night, encountering something that looked dangerous but wasn't. The light left on in the window, not for just any woman, but for one who would misread the situation so completely that she'd choose the sealed diner over the open street. He hadn't created the dancer. The city had done that. Dennis had simply learned to recognize the opportunity when it presented itself. Behind her, the elderly man spoke, asked if he was gone. Claire stood. Her knees creaked. The blood rushed from her head, and she steadied herself against the counter. She turned to face her rescuer to thank him for his kindness to a hysterical woman who had mistaken illness for menace, who had pounded on his door demanding sanctuary from a phantom threat, who had interrupted his quiet evening with manufactured crisis. He stood behind the counter, perfectly still. His hands rested flat on the formica surface, palms down, fingers spread. The wiping cloth lay beside his right hand, folded into a neat square. His face had emptied of the grandfatherly concern. What remained was something else entirely, something patient, something that had been waiting a very long time and had now received confirmation that its patience had been rewarded. His eyes met hers. They were the color of dishwater, a pale gray that might once have been blue but had faded with age to something indeterminate, flat, calculating. Intelligence devoted to a single purpose, refined over years into perfect efficiency. The intelligence that knew exactly how long to wait, how to position a light to suggest safety, how to appear harmless until the moment harmlessness was no longer required. He reached up and turned the open sign hanging in the door to face inward. The word "closed" now faced the street, visible to anyone who might walk past, though no one would walk past at this hour. The fog would see to that. The emptiness of the financial district after dark would see to that. The sound of the sign rotating on its small chain seemed very loud in the silent diner. Then he reached into his pocket and withdrew the keys. The same keys he'd used to unlock the door to let her in. They were on a ring with other keys. Many other keys, more keys than a simple diner would require. Keys to locks she couldn't imagine. He placed them on the counter between them with deliberate precision. The metal clinked against the formica. Then he transferred them to his trouser pocket, making a show of patting the pocket to demonstrate their security. Claire's phone sat on the counter where she'd set it when he pulled her inside, when she'd stumbled and spilled the contents of her bag. 2 meters away. It might as well have been 2 miles. The screen was dark now, locked. The battery icon had shown 15% when she'd last looked. She lunged for it. The movement was pure desperation, all her mother's training about measured responses abandoned. She crossed the distance in 3 strides, her hand closing on the phone's familiar weight. Dennis didn't move to stop her, just watched with that same patient stillness. Her fingers fumbled with the passcode. 1 wrong digit. Tried again. The screen unlocked. Emergency dial already pulled up from earlier. She pressed 999. Lifted the phone to her ear. Dennis's hand closed over hers, not violent, almost gentle. He reached with his other hand and tapped the red circle. The call ended before the first ring could complete. The silence in her ear was absolute. Then he released her hand and returned to his position behind the counter, settling back onto his stool as though nothing had happened. Claire stood frozen, the dead phone still pressed to her ear. She lowered it slowly. The screen showed the call duration, 00. Not even a second. Not enough time for the system to register a location, to create a record, to alert anyone that she'd tried. She understood several things simultaneously, with the clarity that comes from absolute horror. The phone line hadn't been cut recently. It had been cut days ago, perhaps weeks. The frayed wires behind the wall plate were old news, not fresh emergency. The diner hadn't been open. No business stayed open this late in the financial district on a Friday night, when the office workers had long since fled to their suburbs and their families. The single light had been left on for a very specific purpose. A lure. Bait for something that might need light in the darkness, and she, in her desperate flight from imaginary danger, had done exactly what he'd engineered the scenario to make her do. She had assessed the threat incorrectly, had calculated the risk and arrived at precisely the wrong answer, had used all her mother's training to make the one choice that would guarantee her destruction. She had locked herself in. The elderly man didn't move toward her. He didn't need to. There was no urgency in his stillness. He simply stood there, hands flat on the counter, and let her understand. Let her feel the weight of the 3 locks on the door. Deadbolt, chain, sliding bar. Let her inventory the metal shutters now sealed over every window, blocking sound as effectively as they blocked light. Let her calculate the soundproofing qualities of 1930s construction, the thickness of the plate glass, the solid brick walls, the absence of any neighboring businesses that might be occupied at this hour or any hour. Let her realize that she had been so focused on reading one threat, the obvious, visible, behavioral threat of a dancing man with a terrible smile, that she had sprinted directly into another, the invisible threat, the patient one, the one that understood human psychology well enough to exploit it, the one that had been waiting for someone exactly like her. His smile, when it came, was nothing like the dancing man's terrible grin. It was small, polite, the smile of a shopkeeper greeting a customer, the smile of someone who had all the time in the world because time was now his to control absolutely. He gestured to a glass of water on the counter, his movements unhurried. His expression suggested concern for her well-being, as though her terror were merely the after-effect of an unfortunate misunderstanding, rather than the beginning of something far worse. Her mother's voice, always her mother's voice, arrived then. Not with solutions, not with the tactical assessment that had guided her through 28 years. Just recrimination. I taught you better than this. The thought came in her mother's exact cadence, the familiar way she'd delivered disappointment throughout Claire's childhood, the way she'd sounded when Claire had walked home through the park instead of taking the long way round, when Claire had accepted a drink from a stranger at university, when Claire had moved to London despite all warnings. You saw the wrong threat. You failed. Claire's jaw clenched. The voice was worse than Dennis's words because it came from inside, because it carried the weight of truth. She had failed. Every lesson, every warning, every careful instruction about reading danger, all of it had delivered her here. He was just a sick old man dancing, harmless. And you ran from him straight into this? She wanted to scream at the voice, to explain that the dancing man had looked terrifying, that anyone would have run, that the threat assessment had been reasonable given the visible data, but the voice knew better. The voice had always known better. This is what happens when you don't listen. When you think you know better than the woman who kept you safe your whole life. Claire pressed her palms against her eyes until she saw stars. The voice didn't stop. Remember what I told you about men who follow you. Cross the street, change direction, seek light and witnesses. You did all that. And where did it get you? The instructions were useless now. The catalog of responses her mother had drilled into her. All designed for the wrong scenario. For the man who follows you on a dark street, not the man who waits patiently behind a locked door you've opened yourself. You're alone now, really alone, and it's your own fault. The elderly man waited, patient as stone, for her to finish understanding. He seemed content to let the silence stretch, content to let her catalog her situation fully before he proceeded to whatever came next. Claire's mind cycled through possibilities with ruthless efficiency. The windows were sealed, the door triple-locked, her phone out of reach and nearly dead regardless. No one knew where she was. She'd told her flatmate she was working late, nothing more specific. Her mother lived in Harrogate, hours away, and they hadn't spoken in 3 weeks after their last argument about Claire's recklessness in taking the job that required these late nights. The irony of that word, recklessness, would have been funny if Claire's throat hadn't been full of copper and ash. She inventoried the space with the same systematic approach she'd applied to the street outside. The diner was small, perhaps 10 meters by 6. 5 booths along the window wall, their vinyl seats cracked and repaired with duct tape. A counter with 8 stools, the chrome on their bases tarnished. Behind the counter, a service window to what must be a kitchen. That window was covered with a metal grate, locked. She could see through to industrial appliances, all old, all clean with the cleanliness of obsessive maintenance rather than recent use. No second door. Fire code violations everywhere, but that hardly mattered now. The elderly man had positioned himself between her and the front door, not obviously blocking it, but the geometry of the space made the positioning clear. If she ran for it, he would intercept her before she could work the 3 locks. And then what? He was perhaps 70, but she had felt the strength in his hand when he'd pulled her inside. Not the grip of someone weakened by age, but maintained strength from physical labor. Decades of lifting crates, moving furniture, maintaining a business through manual work rather than delegation. She thought of her grandmother's neighbor, 83, and still splitting his own firewood, still lifting bags of cement to repair his garden wall. Wiry strength that deceived, that made you underestimate until you saw him work. Dennis had that same quality. The frame might be aged, but the muscle memory remained. And he'd had the advantage of surprise when he'd pulled her inside. If it came to physical confrontation now, with her exhausted and him prepared, the outcome wasn't certain. It wasn't even likely. He introduced himself. Dennis. Explained he'd owned the place for 42 years. Bought it from the original Stella in 1984. His voice carried that same conversational calm, as though they were simply 2 people getting acquainted in ordinary circumstances. He picked up the wiping cloth and resumed cleaning the counter, the circular motions hypnotic in their steadiness. Claire watched his hands, looking for tremor, for any sign of uncertainty she might exploit. But his movements remained perfectly controlled. He spoke about keeping Stella's name, about respect for what she'd built with her husband after they'd come over from Poland after the war. The words washed over Claire like meaningless sound. Her voice, when she found it, came out smaller than she'd intended. She gestured at the shuttered windows, at the darkness pressing against them. At the transformation the neighborhood had undergone. Dennis's smile remained small, polite. He spoke about change, about how the old customers had died or relocated, how new people wanted chain coffee shops, not places like this. But he'd kept it. Couldn't bear to let it go, even after it stopped making sense to stay open. Claire's fingers twitched toward her pocket. The keys were still there. Useless for locks she couldn't reach, but capable of doing damage if she could get close enough, if she could aim for his eyes, his throat. Her mother had taught her this too, where to strike if striking became the only option. But Dennis saw the calculation. She watched his eyes track the movement of her hand, saw him register the intent. His expression didn't change. He simply set down the wiping cloth and moved his hands to rest flat on the counter again where she could see them clearly. He spoke then, his voice gentle, made a statement about not intending harm. The lie was so brazen, so perfectly calibrated to sound like truth, that Claire almost laughed. The sound that came out was something between a cough and a sob. She gestured at the dead phone line, forced the words out through her constricted throat. Dennis's correction came gently. The phone line had failed, he explained. He'd reported it to British Telecom, twice. They'd promised someone would come. No one had. That was 6 weeks ago. He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. He could have had it repaired privately. He'd chosen not to. Claire's legs were trembling now, the adrenaline exhaustion setting in. She couldn't remain standing much longer. But sitting meant vulnerability, meant accepting the situation as something other than temporary and something other than escapable. The word escaped her lips as barely more than a whisper. Why? Dennis considered the question with apparent seriousness, his head tilting slightly. He spoke about motivations, about the stories people told themselves, about narrative construction that made everyone the hero of their own lives. But underneath, he suggested, humans were simpler. They did what they did because they were compelled to, because their nature demanded it. He moved then, reaching under the counter. Claire's body coiled to run, to fight, but he produced only a glass and a bottle of water. He poured carefully, the liquid catching the fluorescent light, set the glass on the counter between them. He suggested she should drink something. Mentioned shock, dehydration. His tone was that of someone offering comfort to a guest. Claire stared at the glass. The water looked clear, normal. But normalcy meant nothing now. Every gesture of care was suspect. Every kindness a potential trap. Dennis seemed to read her hesitation. Assured her it wasn't drugged. Said he wasn't that sort of person. Didn't need to be. The shutters were down. The door locked. He asked where she would go if she ran. Mentioned the kitchen was a dead end. The back door sealed years ago when inspectors stopped coming. Made it clear there was nowhere to run to. Then he used her name. Claire. He said it casually, as though they were acquainted. She hadn't told him her name, but her bag was still on the floor, its contents scattered. Her Oyster card. Her work ID. He'd had time to look while she was kneeling by the window, while she was watching the dancing man disappear into the fog, while she was understanding how completely she'd misread the situation. Her question emerged with more steadiness. She needed information, needed to understand the parameters of her situation. Dennis picked up his wiping cloth again, spoke about what people wanted, company, understanding, someone who saw them as they really were. Mentioned he'd been alone for a long time. His wife had died 8 years ago, cancer, the lung kind. She'd never smoked, but doctors said it just happened sometimes. Random cellular mutation. Bad luck. He paused, the cloth stopping mid-circle. After her death, he'd kept the diner open. Thought routine would help. Thought purpose would fill the space she'd left. But customers came less frequently each month. Then none at all. He'd been keeping it open for himself, really. Somewhere to go that wasn't the empty house. Somewhere with light and structure. Claire edged slightly to her left, toward the phone on the counter. Dennis's eyes tracked the movement, but he made no move to stop her. He suggested she should check the phone herself. Otherwise, she'd spend her energy on hope that didn't exist. She moved quickly, grabbing the receiver, bringing it to her ear. The silence was absolute. No dial tone, no static, no hiss of a line with poor connection. Just dead air, the sound of severed wires. She pressed the hook frantically. Nothing changed. She slammed the receiver down hard enough to crack the plastic casing. Dennis didn't flinch. Said he understood her frustration. The words came out harder than she'd intended. Told him he understood nothing. Anger was replacing fear, filling the space terror had occupied. Anger was cleaner. Anger didn't paralyze. She identified what he was doing. Kidnapping. The legal term for it. Dennis agreed, though he noted the terminology mattered less than the reality they were experiencing. Words were just sounds people made to pretend they had control over circumstances. Claire's hands were shaking now, but not from fear, from rage. At Dennis, yes, but also at herself and at her mother, at the whole architecture of threat assessment that had delivered her into this moment, at the dancing man whose only crime was being ill in a way that looked frightening, had her own certainty that she could read danger, that her training made her safe. She spoke with more force, told him her flatmate would notice she was missing, would call the police. Dennis's response came measured. When? Tomorrow morning? Afternoon? And what would her flatmate tell him? That her flatmate, who often worked late, didn't come home? They'd take a report. Missing person cases required 24 hours before serious investigation began. He paused, his meaning clear. By then, circumstances would be different. Claire's mind raced through scenarios. 24 hours. What could happen in 24 hours? The phrase contained multitudes of horror, each possibility worse than the last. Her imagination, so skilled at constructing threats from innocent behavior, now applied that same skill to actual danger. Dennis watched her process this with something that might have been sympathy, or might have been satisfaction. The distinction was unclear. He spoke again, his voice quiet. Insisted he wasn't a monster. Wanted her to understand that. Just someone who'd been alone too long. Someone who needed company and found that getting it through conventional means was no longer possible. Old men didn't make new friends easily. They were invisible, discounted, existed on the periphery of the world's attention. Claire's voice had risen to something near a shout. She threw his logic back at him. Questioned whether locking women in defunct diners was his solution to loneliness. Dennis's correction was gentle. Not women, not plural, just her, just tonight. She was the one who'd come to his door, the one who'd needed saving. He spoke about symmetry, her running from someone harmless to someone who wasn't. Said it felt like fate, like the universe offering him something he'd stopped believing he could have. Claire's nails dug into her palms hard enough to draw blood. The pain helped, gave her something to focus on besides the absolute wrongness of his logic, his calm explanation of abduction, as if it were merely an unconventional social interaction. She reminded him of his earlier assurance, that he wouldn't hurt her. His response came measured. He wouldn't. Not if she cooperated. Not if she understood that fighting would only make things harder for both of them. He folded his wiping cloth into a neat square. Said he just wanted to talk, wanted someone to see him, to acknowledge that he existed. Then asked if that was so terrible. The question hung in the fluorescent-lit air. Claire understood then that he genuinely wanted an answer, that some part of him needed her to validate his loneliness, to agree that his response to it was reasonable. She thought of the dancing man still waltzing through the fog, still holding his invisible partner with tenderness and care, still living in a world where his wife hadn't died, where love persisted beyond death's interruption. His madness was gentle, turned inward, harming no one. Dennis's madness was something else entirely. It demanded participation. It required an audience. Her answer came out clear and hard, each word deliberate. She told him it was terrible. Whatever he'd told himself to justify this, it was a lie. He wasn't lonely. He was broken in a way that made him dangerous. And she refused to pretend otherwise to make him feel better about what he was doing. Dennis's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. A recalculation. A revision of whatever script he'd been following. He said it was disappointing. He'd hoped she'd be different, that she'd understand. He moved around the counter then, his pace still measured, still unhurried. Claire backed toward the far wall, her hand closing on her keys, fingers positioning them between her knuckles the way her mother had taught her. Makeshift brass knuckles, better than nothing. Dennis stopped 3 meters away, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough to give her the illusion of space. He spoke about time, about having all he needed, about how she'd change her mind. People did, he said, when the alternatives became clear. When initial defiance exhausted itself and reality set in, she'd realized that cooperation was easier than resistance, that acceptance was less painful than constant fear. Claire's refusal came out steady, unwavering. Dennis's response was mild, 2 words. Then he turned and walked toward the kitchen, disappearing through the service window's grated opening. Claire was alone in the main dining area. She ran to the front door immediately, her hands working the locks with frantic speed. The deadbolt slid free. The chain came loose. But the sliding bar was keyed from both sides, and the key was in Dennis's pocket. She yanked on it until her palms ached. It didn't budge. The window's next. She grabbed a chair, swung it against the shuttered glass. The impact sent vibrations up her arms, but the shutter didn't even dent. Industrial grade, designed to withstand exactly this kind of assault. She was pounding on the metal, screaming for help that wouldn't come, when Dennis emerged from the kitchen. He carried a cup of tea in a chipped mug. He set it on the counter, steam rising. He gestured to it, said it would be there when she was ready. Then he settled onto one of the counter stools, his posture relaxed, and simply watched her, waiting for her energy to deplete, waiting for her voice to give out, waiting with the patience of someone who had nothing but time. Outside, the fog pressed against the shuttered windows. The city continued its Friday night rhythms, oblivious. The dancing man would have reached home by now, a care facility, a son's front step, wherever the city put its gentle lunatics, safe, living in a gentle madness that asked nothing of anyone. Inside, Claire felt her throat going raw from screaming. Her fists ached from pounding. No phone, no witnesses, no exit she hadn't already tested. She stopped screaming, saved her voice, her energy. Her options were narrowing with each passing minute, but as long as she was conscious, as long as she could think, there had to be something, some tool she hadn't considered, some weakness in his plan she could exploit. She returned to the counter, keeping maximum distance, and began to systematically search her scattered belongings. Lipstick, receipts, her Oyster card, her work ID, a pen, tissues. The detritus of ordinary life now transformed into potential weapons or tools by the extremity of circumstance. The pen, she palmed it, kept it hidden. Dennis watched, but said nothing. His tea sat untouched, the steam still rising. Eventually he spoke, observed that she was clever, asked what she'd do with the pen. Write a note? To whom? Suggested that if she meant to use it as a weapon, she'd have to get close, and he was stronger than he looked. Claire said nothing. Her eyes had found something else. Above the last booth, near the ceiling, a ventilation grate. Small, perhaps 30 centimeters square, but large enough. The screws holding it in place were visible even from this distance. Old screws, possibly rusted. She settled against the far wall, the pen hidden in her sleeve, and began to wait. Not for Dennis to come to her, for him to look away, to give her time. An hour passed, maybe more. The clock's second hand swept its endless circles. Dennis remained on his stool, occasionally sipping his tea, but his attention drifted. He gazed at the shuttered windows, at his folded wiping cloth, at nothing in particular, when his eyes closed briefly, just a few seconds, exhaustion claiming its due. Claire moved. Silent steps to the last booth. She climbed onto the table, her movements controlled despite the pounding of her heart. The pen's tip fit into the screw head. The first screw was tight, but she applied pressure, twisted. It gave slightly, then more. She worked it free, caught it before it could fall and clatter against the table. Hope built in her chest like pressure. The second screw came easier. The third. Her mother's voice was silent now, as though holding its breath. The fourth screw began to turn when Dennis spoke from his stool, his voice conversational, not even looking in her direction. That's bricked up behind there. I checked last year. Claire's hand froze, the pen still in the screw head. He continued, explaining about the ventilation system being condemned, the ducts filled with concrete, fire safety regulation. Now he did turn to look at her. That same small smile suggested she should finish removing the screws if she liked. See for herself. He wouldn't want her to think he was lying. Claire's fingers remained locked on the pen. She wanted to scream, wanted to hurl the pen at his face. Instead, she twisted the final screw free with shaking hands. The grate came away from the wall. Behind it, smooth concrete, gray, solid. Recent enough that she could still see the form's impressions in its surface. Dennis had been right. Of course he had. He'd thought of everything. She climbed down from the table, her legs barely supporting her weight. The grate clattered to the floor. She didn't bother picking it up. Dennis seemed to understand the stalemate. He smiled that small smile again. He repeated his earlier observation. About it. About having all of it in the world. The minutes accumulated into an hour. Dennis remained on his stool, occasionally sipping his tea, never taking his eyes from Claire for more than a few seconds. She stayed against the far wall, her mind cycling through escape scenarios and discarding them one by one. The pen in her sleeve felt both substantial and pathetically inadequate. The ventilation grate lay on the floor where she'd dropped it, a monument to futility. Her phone sat on the counter, its screen dark. Dead now. She'd watched it die while Dennis had been in the kitchen, the battery percentage dropping from 15 to 14 to 13, then the screen going black mid-countdown. No final message sent. No location shared, just silence. You should have charged it at the office, her mother's voice observed. I've told you 1,000 times. Always keep your phone charged. Always. Claire pressed her forehead against the cool tile wall. The voice was relentless. If you'd taken a cab, like I said. If you'd stayed in more populated areas. If you'd trusted your instincts about that man. I did trust my instincts, Claire whispered to the empty air. That's the problem. No. You trusted your fear. There's a difference. I taught you to be vigilant, not paranoid. You made the dancing man into something he wasn't. The distinction felt academic now, useless. Her mother's voice had always been better at post-mortem analysis than prevention. Dennis broke the silence suddenly. Told her to tell him about her mother. Claire's head snapped up. The word escaped her lips. What? He elaborated. Her mother. She'd mentioned her when trying the locks. Said she lived in Harrogate. He wanted to know what she was like. The question felt like a violation more intimate than the physical captivity. Her mother was private, sacred, not for this man to know about or discuss or contaminate with his attention. She refused. His response came with gentle authority. Everything about her was his business now. They had hours to fill, days perhaps. They could spend them in silence or they could talk. He preferred talking. It was more human. Claire rejected the premise. There was nothing human about this. Dennis tilted his head slightly. Asked if there wasn't. Loneliness was human, he suggested. The need for connection was human. The lengths people would go to achieve it. That was perhaps the most human thing of all. Her mother had taught her to fear strangers. He was simply proving her right. The irony was that her lessons had delivered her to him. Claire felt something crack inside her chest. The words were too close to her own thoughts, the ones she'd had while watching the dancing man disappear. The recognition that her training, her vigilance, her entire system of survival had failed catastrophically. She spoke about survival, about what her mother had taught her. Dennis leaned forward slightly, suggested her mother had taught her to see threats everywhere, to trust no one. to build walls between herself and the world, asked how that was working for her. The cruelty of the question was almost elegant in its precision. Claire wanted to scream at him, to explain that her mother's lessons had kept her safe for 28 years, that this single failure didn't invalidate decades of successful navigation. But the words stuck in her throat because they weren't entirely true. Her mother's lessons had kept her alone, had made relationships difficult, had turned simple interactions into threat assessments. Her last boyfriend had left after 6 months, frustrated by her inability to trust. His constant cataloging of his behavior for signs of danger that never materialized. Dennis observed her thinking, said he could see it in her face. The doubt, the questioning. Called it progress. Claire rejected the framing. It wasn't progress. It was psychological manipulation, making her doubt herself so she'd be easier to control. His response suggested both possibilities might be true. Or perhaps he was offering perspective she'd been too frightened to consider. He stood stretching. His joints popped. Said he was going to make more tea. Asked if she'd like some. Clarified it was an actual question. She must be thirsty. Claire was thirsty. Her throat ached from screaming, from the copper taste of blood, from the dry fear that had leached all moisture from her mouth. But accepting anything from him felt like capitulation, like agreeing to the premise of this situation as something other than abduction. She refused. Dennis shrugged, told her to suit herself. He moved into the kitchen area, his movements visible through the grated window. She watched him fill a kettle, place it on the stove, the click of the gas igniting, the blue flame beneath the metal. Claire used the moment to test the front door again. The deadbolt and chain remained free, but the sliding bar held firm. She pulled until her muscles screamed. Nothing. She examined it more closely. The lock mechanism was old but well maintained. The key slot showed signs of recent oil. Dennis had prepared for this, had thought through the mechanics of captivity with careful attention. How long had he been planning? How many nights had he sat here with the light on, waiting? How many women had walked past without needing help, without misreading some urban encounter badly enough to seek his sanctuary? She thought of the missing women you heard about on the news, the ones who vanished on their way home from work, from the pub, from normal life, the ones whose faces appeared on posters asking, "Have you seen this person?" until the posters faded and were replaced by newer missing women. How many of those faces had walked past this diner on other nights when the variables hadn't aligned? How many had taken the tube instead, or caught a cab or walked with friends? And how many, 1, 2, more, had been unlucky enough to need help on a night when Dennis was waiting? The precision of his preparation spoke to practice, to refinement. This wasn't his first time thinking through the problem of captivity. Whether it was his first time executing it, she couldn't know. But the smoothness of his movements, the anticipation of her responses, the calm patience with which he watched her, all of it suggested a scenario he'd rehearsed, if not in reality, then in his mind 1,000 times. The kettle began to whistle. Dennis returned with fresh tea, settling back onto his stool. He spoke about his wife, how she used to say he was too fastidious about things. Everything had to be just so. The kitchen organized a certain way. The books alphabetized. She'd found it endearing at first, then irritating. Then toward the end, she'd stopped noticing. The cancer had taken so much of her attention that his little quirks became irrelevant. He sipped his tea. Claire remained silent. He spoke about caring for her through all of it. 2 years from diagnosis to death, chemotherapy, radiation, hospice, bathing her when she couldn't bathe herself, changing her bedding when she couldn't control her bowels, holding her hand while she cried from pain the morphine couldn't quite reach. His voice remained steady. That was love, he said. Real love. Not the romantic notion of it. The actual work of it. Claire gestured at the locked door, the shuttered windows, asked if this was love too. Dennis said it was loneliness. Different thing entirely. Though one could lead to the other in unexpected ways. Claire's fingers tightened on the pen in her sleeve. If she could get him talking, get him comfortable enough to let his guard down, maybe he would come close enough for her to use it. The thought felt both practical and absurd. She'd never hurt anyone. Never even been in a physical fight beyond childhood scuffles. But circumstances compressed ethics into simpler forms. Survival made philosophers of no one. She reminded him of his earlier assurance, that he wouldn't hurt her. He repeated it. He wouldn't. She asked what the end game was, what he thought would happen. Would she develop Stockholm Syndrome? Agree to be his friend? What exactly did he think the outcome would be? Dennis considered the question with apparent seriousness. Said he didn't know. He admitted he hadn't planned this, not specifically. He'd kept the light on some nights, hoping, thinking that maybe someone would need help, that maybe circumstance would bring someone to his door, but he didn't know who or when or what he would do. Tonight, when she pounded on the window, he paused. It felt like fate, like the universe answering a question he'd been asking for years. Claire pointed out the universe hadn't brought her here. A mentally ill man dancing in the street had brought her here, because she'd misread the situation, because she'd seen danger where there wasn't any. Dennis acknowledged the irony. She'd found danger where she didn't see it. Yes, he understood the irony delighted her in some horrible way, but here they were regardless. The how mattered less than the what now. Claire's mind was working through possibilities with increased desperation. The kitchen. There would be knives there. Real weapons, not improvised ones. But the grated window prevented access, and Dennis would see her coming if she tried to circumvent it. The phone. Broken. But the cord might serve as a garrote or restraint if she could get it free from the wall. The glass of water Dennis had poured earlier. She could throw it in his face, use the momentary distraction to rush the door. Each scenario played out in her head with the same conclusion. Dennis was stronger, faster, more prepared. He'd thought through the architecture of this space in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. She told him she needed to use the toilet. Dennis studied her. Explained there was a bathroom through the kitchen. No windows. The door didn't lock from the inside. He'd need to check it first. Make sure there was nothing she could use as a weapon. She asked if he was going to watch her. He said no, but he would ensure she had no opportunities for escape or self-harm while she was in there. He stood and told her to come on. Claire followed him through the kitchen. He was right. No windows. A single stall with a toilet and small sink. Dennis opened the cabinet beneath the sink, removed a bottle of bleach and a container of Ajax, pulled the toilet tank lid off and set it on the floor outside. He gave her 3 minutes. Then he was coming in. Claire entered the bathroom and closed the door. It didn't lock. She could hear Dennis on the other side, his breathing steady. She used the toilet quickly, then scanned the small space for anything useful. The mirror was polished metal, not glass. No sharp edges. The toilet paper holder was bolted to the wall. The faucet handles couldn't be removed without tools. Dennis had prepared this space too. Had thought through every detail. She washed her hands, watching the water swirl down the drain, and understood with complete clarity that he'd done this before. Not this exact scenario, perhaps, but something like it. The precision of his preparation spoke to practice, to refinement. Dennis announced time was up through the door. Claire opened it, returned to the dining area, settled back against her wall. The elderly man watched her with those flat, calculating eyes. Hours passed. The fluorescent light hummed its steady note. Dennis made more tea. Claire's exhaustion grew, her body demanding sleep despite the adrenaline, despite the danger. She fought it, knowing that unconsciousness meant vulnerability. But her eyes grew heavy. Her thoughts began to fragment. She jolted awake. Had she slept? For how long? To find Dennis still on his stool, still watching. The clock on the wall read 3:51 a.m. She'd lost nearly an hour. He observed that she snored slightly, asked if she knew that. The intimacy of the observation made her skin crawl. He'd been watching her sleep, studying her. The thought of his eyes on her unconscious form triggered a wave of nausea she barely controlled. He repeated his earlier assurance. He wouldn't hurt her, not in that way. He wasn't that kind of person. She asked what kind of person he was. He answered plainly. The lonely kind. The desperate kind. The kind who'd been invisible for so long that they'd do terrible things to be seen. He said it without shame, without apparent recognition of how monstrous the admission was. Claire's hatred crystallized into something pure and cold. Not the hot rage from earlier, but something more useful. She began to plan in earnest. Not escape. That seemed increasingly impossible. But harm. If she was going to be here, she would make him regret it, would find some way to hurt him, to make his loneliness worse, to weaponize her captivity against him. She asked if he wanted to talk. Fine. They'd talk about his wife. Asked if his wife had known what he was. Dennis's expression shifted minutely. Good. She'd found a nerve. She pressed on. Asked if his wife knew that the man caring for her so tenderly was capable of this, or if he'd hidden it from her like he hid everything else. He told her not to continue. The word came out harder than anything he'd said before. But Claire pushed. Said his wife would be ashamed of him. Disgusted. If she could see him now, Dennis stood abruptly. His chair scraped against the linoleum. For the first time, Claire saw real anger in his face. The grandfatherly mask had cracked. He told her she didn't know anything about his wife. Claire stood too, the pen sliding into her palm. Said she knew his wife had married a man who locks women in abandoned diners. Knew she'd spent her final years with someone who was counting down the days until he could do this. The words came out hard, each one a weapon. Told him that whatever love he thought he'd had, it was built on a lie. He was always this. She just didn't live long enough to see it. Dennis crossed the space between them in 3 quick strides. His hand closed on her wrist with brutal strength. Claire drove the pen toward his face with her other hand. He caught it mid-strike, twisted, and the pen clattered to the floor. They stood locked together, his face inches from hers. His breath smelled like tea and something underneath it, something fleshy and wrong. He spoke, his voice low and tight, made his denial, turned the accusation back on her mother, on everyone who looked at people like him, old, alone, invisible, and saw nothing worth acknowledging. Said she'd created this. Her indifference, her fear, her walls. He released her wrist and stepped back. Claire's hand throbbed where he'd gripped it. She could see the bruises already forming, perfect impressions of his fingers. The strength in that grip hadn't been the failing grasp of an elderly man. It had been controlled, measured, someone who knew exactly how much force to apply. Dennis returned to his stool, his breathing heavy. the mask reassembling itself piece by piece. He spoke about rest, about how it was late, how they could continue this discussion when they'd both had some sleep. Claire said she wasn't sleeping. He insisted she would, eventually. The body demanded it. He reached under the counter and produced a length of rope. Said he was going to secure her to one of the booth tables, for both their safety. She'd proven she'd attempt violence. He couldn't allow that. Claire backed toward the wall, told him not to touch her. He said he wasn't giving her a choice. He advanced. Claire grabbed the water glass from the counter and threw it. Dennis deflected it easily. The glass shattered against the wall. Claire ran for the door, knowing it was futile, knowing the locks wouldn't yield, but unable to not try. Dennis caught her before she made it 3 steps. His arms wrapped around her from behind, pinning her own arms to her sides. She kicked backward, her heel connecting with his shin. He grunted but didn't release her. She thrashed, screamed, bit at the arm near her face. He dragged her to the nearest booth, forced her down onto the seat. The rope came around her wrists with practiced efficiency. She fought every second, but he was stronger, more prepared. He secured her wrists to the table leg with knots that wouldn't slip. When he finished, he stepped back. His shin was bleeding where her heel had connected. His forearm showed teeth marks, but his expression was calm again, patient. He said this didn't have to happen. She'd forced it. Claire yanked against the rope until her wrists burned. The knots held. Dennis collected the broken glass, sweeping it into a dustpan with deliberate care. Then he settled back onto his stool and simply watched her. The clock read 4:23. Outside, the fog pressed against the shuttered windows. The city continued its Friday night rhythms, oblivious. The dancing man had probably made it home by now, back to his care facility or his son's house, back to whatever space held him between his episodes of waltz and memory, safe, harmless, living in a gentle madness that asked nothing of anyone. Inside, Claire felt her body beginning to shut down despite her will. The exhaustion was too great. The adrenaline had nowhere left to go. Her eyes closed. She forced them open. They closed again. When consciousness returned, gray light filtered through the gap beneath the shutters. Morning, or at least dawn. Her wrists ached. Her neck had cramped from the angle she'd slept at. Dennis was still on his stool watching. He greeted her, his tone conversational, as though they were friends meeting for breakfast rather than captor and captive. Claire said nothing. Her throat was too raw, her mind too exhausted to formulate responses. He said he'd been thinking about what she'd said, about his wife. She'd been trying to hurt him, he understood that. But she'd raised an interesting question. What would his wife think of this? He paused, seeming to genuinely consider it. He said he thought she'd understand. Not condone, perhaps, but understand. She'd lost her first husband in a car accident before they met. She understood what it meant to lose the person who made sense of everything else. After that, you're just relearning how to occupy space. Claire's fingers worked at the knots binding her wrists. They were professional quality, tight but not cutting off circulation, positioned to prevent her reaching them with her teeth. Dennis said he was going to make breakfast. Eggs, toast, tea. She should eat. Maintain her strength. He stood, stretched. Said he'd untie her to use the toilet and eat. But if she tried anything, he'd secure her again. He asked if she understood. Claire nodded. Speaking required energy she didn't have. He accompanied her to the door, waited outside while she used the toilet. Her reflection in the metal mirror showed a stranger, pale, disheveled, eyes red from exhaustion and suppressed tears. She looked away. When she emerged, Dennis had set the counter with 2 plates, scrambled eggs, buttered toast, tea in chipped mugs. The normalcy of it was obscene. He told her to eat. Claire sat on the stool furthest from him, picked up her fork. The eggs were perfectly cooked, soft, seasoned with salt and pepper. The toast crisp. The butter melted into its surface. Her stomach rebelled at first, then accepted the food with desperate hunger. She hadn't eaten since lunch yesterday. Dennis ate steadily across from her. When she'd finished, he collected the plates and washed them in the kitchen sink. The sound of water running, the clink of dishes, all utterly ordinary. He returned with an announcement. He'd decided they'd stay here for a few days, give her time to adjust, to understand that he meant what he said about not hurting her. After that, he paused. They'd see. Maybe she'd come to his house. It was more comfortable than here. Had a spare room. She could have privacy, some freedom, if he could trust her. Claire's mind recoiled. Days, possibly weeks, in this man's home. The scenario extended into a future she couldn't contemplate without her sanity fracturing. She told him people would look for her. He agreed. They would. And they wouldn't find her, not here. This building was scheduled for demolition in 3 months. No one came by. The city had forgotten it existed. He settled back onto his stool. Her flatmate would file a missing persons report. The police would check her last known location, the office. They'd review CCTV footage showing her leaving. They'd interview her coworkers. Eventually, she'd become another statistic, another woman who vanished in London. It happened more often than people thought. The words carried the weight of truth. Claire knew the statistics, knew how many women disappeared each year, how few were ever found. She thought of her mother in Harrogate, how the news would reach her, how her worst fears about the city, about Claire's refusal to heed her warnings, would be confirmed, how she would blame herself and Claire in equal measure. She spoke about her mother, about how she'd never stop looking, how she'd spend every penny, every waking hour, how she'd hire private investigators, make posters, haunt the police station until they were sick of her. Because that's what she did. That's who she was. She saw threats everywhere, and when one finally took Claire, she'd hunt it with everything she had. Dennis studied her. Said perhaps. But London was large, and he was patient and careful. They'd see who had more endurance, her mother's grief or his caution. Claire felt something break inside her. Not her will. It remained intact, hard and cold. But something else. Some last illusion that this would end well, that rescue was coming, that the world made sense. She was alone, truly alone, with a man whose loneliness had curdled into something that demanded satisfaction regardless of cost. The fluorescent light hummed. The clock ticked toward 6 a.m. Outside, London was waking up. People heading to early shifts, bakers opening their shops, the city continuing its rhythms, indifferent to one missing woman in a shuttered diner. Claire thought of the dancing man one final time, still waltzing in her memory, his smile terrible and innocent, holding his dead wife with such tenderness. A man lost in gentle madness, harming no one. And here was Dennis, sane, calculated, intentional in every action, proving which kind of madness was truly dangerous. Her mother's voice arrived one last time, softer now, almost gentle. You can't undo this. You can't go back to the moment before you pounded on his door. That choice is made. Claire knew. God, she knew. But you're still alive. That means you still have choices ahead. The voice was right. For once, the catalog of threat responses had something useful to offer. When escape isn't possible, survival becomes the goal. When survival isn't possible, making it cost him something becomes the goal. She met Dennis's eyes across the counter and made her decision. She would survive this, not through compliance, not through giving him what he wanted, but through patience of her own, through careful observation, through waiting for the single moment of mistake he would eventually make. Because everyone made mistakes, even careful, patient predators. And when he did, she would be ready.